It's a very famous scene in the movie The Godfather, where Sonny Corleone is describing his plan to take someone out. And I don't mean take him out to dinner. Everyone in the room tells Sonny that he is absolutely crazy and that he shouldn't get involved, and he's letting his personal feelings dictate what he's going to do. And Sonny insists, it's not personal. It's strictly business. And of course, that claiming something is merely business and not personal was supposed to make someone feel better about being whacked. And I'm supposing that it did not. I'm supposing that did not work at all. But there's a logic behind the statement that if something does not involve a broken relationship or is done against you personally, simply because of who you are, that is not a judgment against you, and that is supposed to make you feel better. When I was in junior high, there was this junior high gal I wanted to ask out to homecoming, and so I asked her to go to homecoming, and she said no, and I said, oh, so you must be busy that night? No, she said. You're going with someone else? No, she said. You're not feeling well? No, she said. And I said, well, why can't you go? She said, Eric, I don't know how to say this. I don't like you. I just don't like you. It was absolutely personal. What happens when it is all about you and the relationships and the hurts and judgments against you? How do we overcome that? Well, situations, circumstances, events, those don't break us. Those don't break us. But relationships do. Relationships do. The hardest thing in life to overcome is the hurts, the pains, the wounds that are caused by other people, especially people who we love. But even there, God is with us. A God whose body was broken on the cross, who was betrayed by those whom he loves. His word tells us he will be with us personally. That for God, it is always personal, involving you and me. So we talked about this morning another episode from Jacob's family where it is absolutely personal. And last week we picked up the story with Jacob, and he had to leave his homeland because his brother wanted to kill him. He was on the run. He was looking for a wife, and so Jacob took a 500-mile journey by foot to find some people that he had never met and asked them to help him find his wife. And Jacob emerged from the journey out of the wilderness, and he came up to a well. And at this well, there were some shepherds who were watering their sheep, and he asked them if they knew his uncle Laban, who he was trying to find. And the shepherds said, yeah, we do know Laban. We know Laban well. In fact, his daughter Rachel is on her way there right now. And so Jacob introduced himself to his cousin Rachel. He helped her get some water, and then they ran and told her father Laban that he was arrived. And everyone was overjoyed, and they were happy, and they hugged and kissed each other. And Uncle Laban said to his nephew Jacob, surely you are my bone, and you are my flesh, meaning that he was family. Laban immediately told Jacob, this is personal between you and me. Now, what we're going to see is that being bone and flesh of Laban was not necessarily a very good thing to be. Because after Jacob worked Laban's sheep for about a month, Laban approached him and he said, Jacob, what can I pay you? My own flesh, my own bone, what can I pay you for your work? And Jacob responded that he wanted to marry Rachel, with whom he was already in love. In fact, Rachel would end up being the love of his life. And Jacob promised to work for Laban for 7 years. 7 years to be Rachel's husband, unpaid. Now, 7 years is a long time, but the Bible teaches that they were just like a few days to Jacob because he was so very much in love with Rachel. And then finally, at the end of 7 years, the big day came, and Laban threw a big feast. Likely, it is strongly implied in the text, likely with a lot of drinking. And at the end of the wedding feast, when it was dark, Laban presented his daughter, veiled, to Jacob, and they consummated the marriage. But it was not Rachel who was behind the veil. It was her older sister, Leah, who Jacob did not love. And the Bible just makes no bones about it. Rachel was physically very beautiful. Leah was not. And the morning came, and there was light, and Jacob recovered from the night before, and he realized what had happened. And he immediately went to Laban, the man who was his bone and flesh. And the word says, Jacob said to Laban, what is this that you have done to me? Did I not serve you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me? And Laban said, well, it is not so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. And to which Jacob said, that information would have been nice 7 years ago. Well, Laban, he just played innocence. He claimed to be a man of integrity. He said, Jacob, I didn't deceive you. You're just ignorant of proper manners. I don't know how you do it where you're from, but here, this is how we roll. Now, there's a name for this kind of thing. We call it baloney, or whatever you want to call it. But Laban, he made a deal with Jacob that he could not refuse. If Jacob really wanted to marry Rachel, and he wanted to marry her right away, there was still something Laban was willing to do, something he could do. He said, complete the week of this one, meaning Leah, and we will give you the other one also in return for serving me another 7 years. So Laban feigns generosity. He feigns a big heart, implying there had been some kind of unfortunate misunderstanding here. And after the week-long wedding celebration was over with Leah, then Laban would allow Rachel to marry Jacob if he would only pledge to give him another 7 years of servitude. Jacob, of course, immediately agreed because he loved Rachel. Love makes you do crazy things. So Laban got what he wanted out of Jacob, out of his relationship with his own bone and flesh. He married his 2 daughters, including the older, less desirable one. He received 14 years of servitude from this very capable Jacob to do it. And Jacob's 14 years of work actually made Laban a very wealthy man. But we have to ask, what was the cost? What was the cost to Laban? Well, Laban broke the bone of his bones, and he tore the flesh of his flesh to get what he wanted. And I'm not just talking about Jacob here. I'm also talking about his daughter, Leah. Laban gave his daughter to a man who did not love her because he didn't want the embarrassment. He didn't want the headache of having, in that culture, of having a single older daughter. And it was devastating for his daughter to be married to a man that did not love her. And then a man who, with only a few days after marrying her, married her younger sister as well. Genesis 29:31 tells us that Leah was hated. Hated. It was absolutely personal. Absolutely personal. And I think this begs the question for all of us about every relationship that we have. From our relationship to God, to our family, to our employer, to our next door neighbor. And the question is this: am I here to serve, or am I here to be served? Am I seeking to get more than I am willing to give? Do I love my neighbor as myself? And we struggle in life having healthy relationships. But the golden rule of relationships is that healthy relationships are born of the conviction that I exist to serve, that I am here to love my neighbor as myself. I am a husband, a wife, a son, a daughter, a friend, a cousin, an uncle, employer, employee, not to serve myself, but to serve others. You know who handled relationships this way? Maybe you've heard of him. His name is Jesus. Mark 10:45. For the Son of Man, even the Son of Man, came not to be served, but to serve. And when we seek to serve and not to be served, we make our relationships personal, and we make them potent. And what we see here in this brief story is a textbook of what not to do. We see someone who is committed to using other people for his own ends rather than being a servant to them. So the question this morning is, how do we do the opposite? How do we serve rather than seek to be served? Even if we've been broken, even if it has been personal, even if sitting here this morning we feel like we have no margin to serve anyone at all because we are so overwrought. How do we serve rather than be served? First thing we do, I think, is we tell the truth. We tell the truth. Laban's initial mistake was in not being honest with Jacob. He just wasn't honest. If he was not, or he was unwilling to marry his younger daughter first, why not just say so at the beginning? Well, Laban was not being truthful because he was serving himself by being dishonest. But by being dishonest, he created a situation in which the only way out was to further deceive Jacob and place his daughter Leah in a terrible situation. See, being dishonest in our relationships creates a situation and fosters a circumstance where we must serve ourselves. Dishonesty leaves us no choice but only look to our own interests in order to maintain the illusion that our deceit has created. And what may have begun as a shading of the truth with a purpose of preserving someone's feelings or avoiding an uncomfortable situation, once we are dishonest, we have to find a way to preserve the appearance of integrity. And that becomes a real burden to serve ourselves. Notice how Laban did it. Notice how he did it. He tried to disguise his deceit by standing behind tradition. And in the long run, it only made things worse. Much, much worse for a lot of people. Well, what does honesty look like? In this case, let's look at the other path. What would have happened if Laban had been honest with Jacob? What would have happened? My suspicion is that the capable, enterprising, madly in love Jacob would have moved heaven and earth to find a husband for his sister-in-law. The Bible makes no bones about it. Jacob was a can-do guy. He knew how to get things done. People would have been blessed in that situation rather than cursed. See, honesty in our relationships produces opportunities for God to work, for blessings to be poured out, for people to put their God-given talents and abilities to service. Honesty is how God deals with us. He provides us the unconditional truth about who we are, and it is a hard truth. God's word teaches that we're sinners, that our hearts are corrupt, that we are selfish, we are prone to anger and wrath, and we can't save ourselves even with our best efforts. What makes this unconditional truth bearable is it comes with unconditional love. At the same time that God tells us the hard truth about ourselves, He loves us absolutely, even while we were still sinners. See, unconditional love and unconditional truth is the forge of deep, satisfying relationships, the kind of relationships that make us better women and men. Second thing that we need to do to serve is we need to show grace. We need to show grace. Serving someone or being selfish creates a cycle that continues far beyond our immediate circumstance. Now, Laban's choice to be selfish with his daughters, first Leah and then Rachel, had terrible consequences that actually echoed for generations. Now, Leah, the word says, has had children with Jacob, and she did the same thing with her children that her father did to her. She used her children as a tool to make her husband love her. Leah learned that lesson so very well from her dad. Genesis 29, verses 32 through 34. Leah conceived and bore a son and called his name Reuben, for she said, "Because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me." She conceived again and bore a son and said, "Because the Lord has heard that I am hated, He has given me this son also." And she called his name Simeon. And she conceived and bore a son and said, "Now this time my husband will be attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons." Therefore his name was called Levi. Now, Levi was very different than his other brothers because Levi had incredibly good genes. Incredibly good genes. Okay, all right, we'll keep it moving. It got a little serious there. He had incredibly good genes, riveting personality. Riveting personality. All right. Enough said about that. So, Leah learned from her father Laban that her family exists to serve your needs and your purposes. And that's how she saw her sons. She thought Reuben would make Jacob love her. She thought that Simeon would stop Jacob from hating her. With the arrival of Levi and now 3 sons, she thought that would cause Jacob to become attached to her. Well, it didn't work. It didn't work. It didn't work for a simple reason. We cannot control other people. This is classic behavior in a relationship when someone wants affirmation or they want appreciation or they want to be loved. We believe that if we can only give them what they want, if we can bend to their wishes and desires, if we can make the other person happy. And by the way, those who say, "Oh, I never do that." What's the most common piece of marriage advice for men? Happy wife, happy life. It doesn't work. Then we'll be affirmed. We'll be validated. We'll be loved. We only control people to serve ourselves. That's the only reason why we control people, to serve ourselves, never to serve them. And we need to understand that controlling people is not even something that God attempts to do. God has given us free will, and He wants us to choose to love Him, to serve Him, to follow Him. What we are called to do instead is to show His grace. We are instead to serve without thought of what we get in return. We are to love without weighing any kind of response. We are to forgive before someone even repents. Selfishness creates a cycle, the kind of cycle of Leah seeking to use her children to make her husband love her. But grace, service without reward, and loving without weighing a response, that breaks that old cycle. It creates a new cycle. Nothing is more liberating than loving someone regardless of the consequences. Nothing is more liberating than that. This is how Jesus loves us, unconditionally. He does not weigh our response in how He chooses to love us. And then third and finally, we rest in Jesus and we rest in His plan. God always makes it personal with us. He's personally involved, and God has a plan for our life. Then we may ask her, well, what about God's plan for Leah? Didn't look like a very good plan to me. Was this plan that she not be loved by her husband? She live her entire life under the burden of feeling unloved and undervalued by a man whom she loved? Well, God gave Leah children. It doesn't always work in that way, of course, but in Leah's case, that's one way God showed up to meet at least some of her needs. See, Matthew 6:8 makes it very plain. Your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. He knows what we need before we even ask Him. And God showing up in our life, it doesn't mean that we get the life that we choose, or that our problems are solved, or that life is easy, or that relationships are repaired. Indeed, God showing up in our life rarely looks the way that we think it will look. But we can rest in the truth that Jesus will serve our needs. Here's the question. It's a question that I find myself asking. Would I rather have the life I think I want, but is outside of God's plan and minimizes His presence and minimizes His grace? Or would I rather see His plan come to pass, full of presence and full of grace in my life? Do I want what I want so badly that I'm willing to push God away to get it? Leah had a fourth child. And she approached this fourth child very differently than she did the first three. See, Leah had given up on attempting to make Jacob love her. Instead, she simply chose to be grateful for the blessing she had. Genesis 29:35. And she conceived again and bore a son and said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. See, Leah just praised God for that fourth child. She was content to rest in the grace and the plan God provided. Now some may say, so God just ignored Leah and her desires, and you're trying to tell me that that's okay? He gives her 4 kids rather than a loving husband, and that's supposed to make it all better? Does God do the same thing with my desires and my wants? Of course not. Of course not. Our Father knows what we need before we even ask for it. He knows the most fervent desires and hopes and dreams. He plumbs the depths of our soul more deeply than we could even hope to do. If our hopes go unfulfilled, if our dreams unmet, it is often because we are not thinking big enough. We are settling for a hope and a dream that serves only me rather than one that serves God and serves humanity. If I have a hard time resting in the plan, the life that I've been given, if I have a hard time seeing Jesus' plan amidst my struggles, I need to ask, who am I serving with my life? Am I serving myself or am I serving Jesus? You see, God will be ruthless in making us serve Him. he will be ruthless in making a servant. And he was ruthless with Leah. But he had a grand plan for her life. Leah wanted a husband who loved her for who she is. Despite the fact that she was unattractive, she'd been compared her whole life to her beautiful sister Rachel. But did Leah's desires serve herself, or did they serve God? God was determined that Leah would serve him. Leah's fourth son, the son for whom she gave praise, his name was Judah. And Judah's family became a tribe. And one day, a member of that tribe would be born, a man known as the Lion of Judah, God's only son, Jesus. Within Leah lay the DNA, the biological stuff that would become God's only son. God's only son would become bone of Leah's bone and flesh of Leah's flesh. And this Jesus, God's only son, would describe himself again and again using a very particular, specific description, a very meaningful description to a woman like Leah, a woman who struggled to find love with her husband. Jesus often described himself as the husband and the church as his bride. Leah would provide billions with the loving husband she so desperately craved. Leah played a decisive role in giving the world a husband who would love us despite the fact that we are so unattractive in our struggles and our sin. And Jesus gave meaning to Leah's pain and struggles. And he will do the same for you and me, because he makes it his business to get personal with our lives. Jesus serves us. The King of all creation, the Lord of sea and sky, makes it his business to serve you personally. And he serves us in a relationship with him so that we can serve others in our relationships with them. Remember, with Jesus, his business is always personal. It's always personal. Mike, would you pray with us, please?